Hey, it's Keith. If you're a lover of audio drama like I am, you need to know about the Apollo app. Apollo is designed around audio drama, so finding your next story is easy. You can always listen through Apollo for free, but there's also the Apollo Plus subscription. With it, you get ad-free listening, exclusives, and other bonus content for over 40 shows. And 70% of the revenue on Apollo Plus goes to those creators. Join Apollo Plus through the Apollo Podcasts app or apollopods.com. Hello, and welcome to the first episode of a podcast about audio drama and the creative process. I'm W. Keith Timms, audio drama producer and podcaster. In this show, I listen to the first episode of an audio drama, then have a discussion with the creators about their show, their methods, struggles, and successes. Today, we're discussing the first episode of Hello from the Hallowoods.
Darker than your dreams, and farther north than you remember, there is a forest where life and death meet. Ladies, gentlemen, and indescribable beings, I have not interrupted your nightmares before. I am the one who watches when you think no one is watching. I am in the shadow under your bed, and I know each skeleton in your closet. You have so many skeletons in your closet. I see where you have been and who you used to be, but I do not know where you are going. Where are you going? I am a guardian of all who dream. I am 100 eyes in the dark. I am your loyal host, Nicky Nick, for the first and certainly not the last time, bidding you hello from the Hallowoods.
Created by William A. Wellman, Hello from the Hallowoods is a queer fiction podcast where a cosmic narrator follows the increasingly connected residents of the forest at the end of the world. While there are elements of horror in these tales, the story is often told in a meditative and poetic way. Wellman writes storylines that often seem unrelated, but over time, these threads come back together to show the interconnectedness of the residents of this supernatural post-apocalypse. The first episode, Keys, mostly focuses on the introduction of Diggory Graves, a Frankenstein's monster who is searching for their purpose, and their encounter with a ghost bound to a haunted piano. There are also tales of Jonah, who is trapped in a flood, and Riot, who is captured by a being of musical instruments. All of these stories are related to us by Nicky Nick, a godlike being voiced by Wellman. I spoke to William remotely from their home. Tell me a little bit about yourself as an artist and a creative person.
I think I've always been interested in writing from a young age, but I'd kind of fallen out of that for a while. I went through a stage of different sort of creative phases where it was like, well, maybe writing would be too out there, but maybe like architecture would still be something creative I could do in the real world. And maybe not architecture, but maybe I could do this other thing. I got really interested in animation for a while and eventually found my way falling into a business marketing degree. And in some dark alternate universe, I probably am still a business marketer to this day. However, as I was getting towards the end of that degree, I had been realizing all throughout that this was about the last thing I wanted to do. Like everything that a business marketer does, and especially when it comes to like marketing for like big corporations, is really to just kind of like ensure that these kind of like institutions stay kind of profitable, and to do that like as subversively as possible. the ideal thing for a marketer is that like you don't realize that you're being marketed to. You just sort of have it as an integrated part of your daily experience. And all this was really not sitting right with me. So as I was getting out of school, I resolved like, okay, I think what I would like to do is actually go revisit my writing dreams. I have this new interest in horror. I have this new interest in like sort of queer issues and queer representation. I would really like to kind of do something that would merge those two categories or kind of sit at the intersection of that. And so from those kind of thoughts, I started germinating this idea about a story where it would be sort of a post-apocalyptic setting where we've seen the effects of climate change, we've seen the effects of sort of super capitalism, and that could kind of sit as an intersection of queer issues and sort of age-old horror tropes and kind of explore some stories in that space. And so really that's where sort of the seed for Hello from the Hallowoods came from. And as for many podcasters, when COVID ended up hitting in 2020, that suddenly became a window where I had a lot of like extra quiet space to kind of develop this story and actually get the podcast on the road. So it was Halloween of 2020 that Hello from the Hallowoods episode 1 debuted. And then we've been sort of rolling weekly ever since. That was my first big audio project. That was my first sort of writing project outside of a couple of short stories I'd gotten published. And so it was really like sort of a step into the unknown, wondering if anyone would actually resonate with that story, whether anyone was thinking about these things in this way. And since then, I've been pleased to find that there are at least a couple people that, have kind of responded to the story. And they're the ones who keep tuning in.
Did you do any kind of artistic stuff when you were younger, or maybe before school?
I've always, I think, even when I was focusing on, business school, like in the margins, I'd be doodling these characters that would someday end up in Hello from the Hallowoods. I've always had an interest in drawing, in writing, and I think it's taken a lot of practice on those fronts to end up being able to do any of those, I think, halfway competently. But, the interest has always been there. And then I think as I've started to take having a creative career more seriously, I've been able to sort of start honing those skills and look for ways to like actively improve them rather than just as a hobby.
How did you come to audio drama as a medium you wanted to explore?
Audio drama was kind of, I would say, not top of mind when it came to sort of starting a writing career. Originally I was thinking, I could publish a novel and then, publish another novel and another novel and another novel. And eventually when I've published about 15 or 20 novels, then I might be able to make a living as a writer in this day and age. But then it was like, well, I'm not sure if I want to wait until I'm halfway through my life to like be making a career out of writing. I'm not sure I want to spend like the next 20 years in this marketing job until then. So that came around to figuring out, okay, what else could I do to present a story that would allow the audience to get kind of engaged with it, and that would allow it to kind of go out there to the world. I tossed around a graphic novel, tossed around webcomics, tossed around like a series of lengthy blog posts. But eventually I circled back around to podcasting. And I hadn't listened to very many at that point. I had completed the entire like run, I think, of the first 2 Adventure Zone seasons, but I had never even at that point listened to like Welcome to Night Vale. As I was like, okay, I think I should do a podcast route for this. So I started like actually listening to these other shows and starting to figure out, okay, how have they done things? If I'm going to make a show like this, what can I do for this project?
And so you really didn't have any experience with audio drama going into this. So did you do this by yourself then?
Absolutely. It is to this day a one-person operation. I would not necessarily, for like new podcasters out there, recommend that you go out and be like a sole proprietor for your show. I think also like, and I didn't know this when I had started, but there is such a big community of fans around shows like the Magnus Archives, around shows like Welcome to Night Vale. I think I very easily, even back in 2020, could have like walked into Twitter or walked into the right Discord server and been like, hey, podcast fans, half of you have unique skills and half of you want to like make a show of your own. Would anyone be interested in collaborating with me for like a 3 or 4 person team to make a show? And I think if I'd done that, I probably would have been able to find some people who could have alleviated some of the burden in marketing or sound editing or writing or voice acting. Because I was the only podcaster I knew at the time, I ended up structuring Hello from the Hallowoods so that although it can occasionally have guest voices on, most of the time it can run as sort of a single voice show with an amount of story that I can write, from week to week.
You said you had an interest in both horror stories and also into queer stories. Can you tell me about what draws you to those particular kinds of issues and themes?
Oddly enough, kind of the interest in both really kind of emerged around the same time. The time of life when I was kind of coming to understand my own identity, when I was beginning to kind of come out to friends in my community, that kind of prompted a lot of thought into not only my experience, but starting to learn more about other queer people's stories as well. And at the same time, a genre that I'd always kind of written off as being horror is just for people who like lots of blood and gore, are surprised by jump scares every time. And I had never really seen a lot of value in it. I'd always kind of relegated it to the B movie bin at the superstore. And I'd watched some, ostensibly horror films like the Alien franchise before. And, I didn't necessarily see the potential in that genre that I do now. And it was about that time that I started to kind of intake some stories that kind of changed my perspective on that. I kind of fell into it from the animated series side of things through a show called Over the Garden Wall, which strangely enough, although it was presented for children on a Cartoon Network, mostly deals with folk horror, and all the tropes and the setting is really pulled from that. I had not seen before, you can actually take kind of the language of horror, but then, package it or speak with it in a different way. Horror can be a genre where you encounter a lot of metaphor and where you can talk about things that are difficult to talk about in the real world through the metaphor of that story, and then kind of come out on the other side with something that I hope outlives kind of the story itself. And so that struck me as ooh, I didn't see the potential here before for kind of writing stories that can use these elements of horror to tell stories about queerness and about queer representation and about how we grapple with these issues in life.
What does queer fiction mean to you?
Queer fiction, I would largely define as fiction by creators that are queer. There may not be kind of a blanket way to define that per se. It became important at that time that that was kind of the set of issues and that was kind of the set of experiences that I was talking about in these stories. And so it would be relatively easy, and I think many stories have done quite well, is to just have people who are queer inside your monster story, running from the slasher like any other character. That I would say that's a story with representation. What I wanted to do from Hello from the Hallowoods was not just tell stories about monsters that queer people happen to be adjacent to, but specifically to tell stories about monsters that kind of incorporate themes and elements of queerness to hopefully tell stories through these old tropes in the horror genre and put a twist on them to make people really re-examine certain perspectives, or kind of to address an issue in a way that people haven't seen before.
Do you think there's something about the horror genre that plays well with queer writing or queer identities?
I think it does, particularly because the horror genre can be a place, often kind of within the metaphor of the story, where we look at these dark sort of real world issues and are able, I think, to kind of explore them in extremes or explore them in angles that we maybe couldn't in sort of a more literal story. But I would also say, even historically, a lot of the people that we would look to as sort of the founders of the horror genre were either queer or, kind of ostensibly were. I find not only is there a good potential in just what you're able to do with the genre now, but I think the roots of that go back quite a long ways. It's been interesting to see in podcasting, especially, how creators have kind of gravitated to this specific genre, potentially in the wake of shows like Welcome to Night Vale that very early on were setting a bar for representation within the genre. And then I think popularized probably over the course of 2020 and 2021 by the Magnus Archives, which, became a bit of a like internet sensation and really, I think, pulled in a wave of like sort of younger listeners as well.
Yeah. Horror often deals with like otherness. There is something outside of human experience or outside of accepted human behavior. And typically that's usually the monster that is given these qualities of otherness.
A lot of Hello from the Hallowoods narratives kind of look like, oh, I am a something with 3 eyes and 14 tentacles. Everyone that, looks upon me falls into trembling and madness. How do I make any connections? Like, how do I still make a meaningful life? And, is there any way for me to like reach out to other people and like be understood for who I am, which is not actively malicious, but it is 3-eyed and maddening.
Yeah.
And so, I found it kind of a wonderful space to explore with that little bit of empathy. And kind of take, I guess, a different look at a lot of these tropes that we've seen time and time again.
Diggory Graves only knew 3 things. The first was that their name was Diggory Graves. They were alone when they awoke in the sunken manor, but the black jacket laid out nearby fit them perfectly, and it said "Property of Diggory Graves" on a little embroidered tag. The spikes on the shoulders looked as vicious as Diggory felt. The second was that they were dead. It had taken them some time to work that one out, but there were plenty of clues. The stitched-up scars that ran across their waist, around their wrists, and up the back of their necks spoke to this, as did the lack of breathing or a pulse. They weren't sure how this left them able to stumble along in the bleary daylight, but they felt if they questioned it too much, they might unravel completely. The third was that they were looking for something. Had it been days or months since they had first started their gloomy march across the bogs and pine barrens? They had encountered a shed with broken windows, and an overturned car consumed by rust. But neither of these satiated the deep hunger that was consuming Diggory. Ahead, between the trees, Diggory caught a glimpse of a house and stopped in their tracks. Perhaps this was what they were looking for.
I'm curious if your own personal experiences with queerness and discovering that about yourself influences how you approach your storytelling.
It absolutely does. I think there are especially a couple of characters whose kind of journeys and philosophies kind of mirror my own in some ways. I think also sometimes writing itself can be a bit of an act of exploration. And definitely these last probably 3 years have seen me grow a lot as a person, in addition to the growth of the characters throughout the story. I will also say that as someone who has been through, say, a lot of religious trauma in relation to queerness, that is something that the story explores, I think, quite heavily, because, that is sort of a particular angle of life that I have been through. It is something that I see kind of reflected in certain interactions and certain characters within the story.
What is Hello from the Hallowoods in your own words? When you think about this show, what do you think about?
I think of a marketing problem because Hello from the Hallowoods has been such a difficult show to really pin down to a nifty elevator pitch. And I'm just tickled every time to see that fans also struggle to capture exactly what the show is. But that said, if I was going to try, I would say that Hello from the Hallowoods, broadly speaking, it's a show set in about 2051. A bit after the apocalypse, actually a long way after the apocalypse, and in a world where there's kind of a supernatural element that sort of changes life. It leaked out of the oceans when the glacier ice melted, and it has kind of added a lot of supernatural elements to this world. Within this world, we find a lot of different, largely queer characters of various walks of life. Some of them are Frankenstein's monsters. Some of them are ghosts. Some of them are sort of human, like zombie apocalypse survivors, trying to like create a community out there in the forest. Some of them are like deep into arcane studies and trying to figure out a way that magic might be able to like remedy the world from its current situation. And then a vast majority of the population have gone to sleep in kind of this almost dreaming reality, sort of a virtual reality equivalent, where they can safely sort of spend their days in entertainment and kind of ignore the ongoing situation above. And it is in this landscape that we jump from one perspective to the next. There's sort of an elder god, not dissimilar to Lovecraft sort of beings named Nick, who serves as sort of the Rod Serling narrator of the story. And he kind of takes us from one perspective to the next, sharing these little snippets out of these various people's lives. And then as the first season goes on, you'll find that we revisit a lot of these people, and eventually their lives each kind of interact with each other in this landscape until we're really telling a very large story about like a good probably 20 or 30 people. Kind of the like elaborate story frame that I have is that, you know, if you are dreaming in the world of Hello from the Hallowoods, this is what that nightmare god Nick is kind of like putting into your dreams. But his sort of progress in doing that and his little status updates and his asides and his like, you know, sort of world events, so to speak, are interrupted about once an episode by someone else who is using Dream as an advertising platform. And that would be a character named Lady Ethel Mallory, who works for sort of a mega corporation.
Here at the Botulus Corporation, maker of the Dreaming Box, your comfort is our dream. As a result, all advertising you see in your dreamscape has been customized to your unique preferences, wants, and needs. We believe that it is your right to be matched with products that fit you perfectly, so that your hard-earned wages can go towards improving your life with brands that understand you, brands that know you, brands that value your feelings and thoughts. People come and go, but brands are eternal.
I wanted to do some commentary on the fact that for every sort of great emotional podcast story that you can listen into today, you know, about halfway through they'll interrupt and then try to sell you mattresses or meal boxes or, you know, sock subscriptions. And, you know, I understand that's the nature of advertising, but also I thought maybe I could take sort of that expectation and have that advertising break be, instead of for a real world product, be for something that is within the story and will slowly fill you in on a different side of the story.
It feels like an anthology story, right? It's a series of different kinds of stories that happen, and they are horror. They deal with really creepy and scary subjects. But when I listen to it, I'm not like terrified, right? I feel like they're more like macabre meditations almost.
I would accept the macabre meditations for sure. I had fallen in love with several stories that begin by seeming unconnected, and then slowly you put together those connections over time. And you realize like, oh, this character was back there when this happened. Like this object had significance in this character's story. And so the first maybe 10 episodes of Hello from the Hallowoods are really designed for that experience. I think you could get through about the first maybe 3 or so without really putting together that like everything is connected. Most of these characters will be important later on. But as time goes on, I think you do lose that anthology like collection a little bit.
Yeah.
And it almost becomes more a story that the perspective keeps changing, even though there is one sort of central storyline happening.
The first episode is called Keys. And it has sort of three main storylines that we are introduced to. We first hear about a character named Jonah, who is cleaning out his father's office in the basement of his house, which is becoming flooded. The lake nearby is overflowing. And then as he remembers his father, he gets swept up and trapped in this cabinet. Presumably he will find out more in a later episode. And then we have a similar kind of cliffhanger-esque ending. The third story is about Riot, who is, we know that she's run away from home, which is a bunker, and she's being chased by the Instrumentalist, which is some sort of monster or creature or person whose approach is signaled by a variety of musical instruments coming towards you. She is also snatched up by the Instrumentalist, and we don't know what happened to her. The middle story is about Diggory Graves, a dead person of some sort, a monster with knives for fingers, and Diggory is searching for something as they wander the land. They meet a ghostly boy named Percy in an old house who is bound to this piano within the house. Diggory has this opportunity to relieve their loneliness with a new friend, but also realizes that they could free Percy from his curse and also then lose this new friend that they found.
I think the central highlight of the story is about Diggory, this Frankenstein-esque monster who has not really met anyone yet. It almost parallels that early stage of Frankenstein where, the monster goes out into the world and is still kind of learning from each experience that it traverses. It strikes me as a little bit tragic, I think, that Diggory, is immediately, upon being given the opportunity for this companionship, forced to choose between keeping that companionship in what would be kind of a selfish way versus ending that companionship by setting this ghost free, which is what the ghost wants. And so, slight spoilers for Hello from the Hallowoods, but, we do see a good bit more of both Diggory and Percy throughout the story. But, I think that emotional tone and kind of this bittersweet feeling that Diggory has at the end of I at least know now what I was missing and what would kind of fill this emptiness that I feel, and that would be companionship. That would be having someone else who understands my experience.
When Diggory opened their eyes, the see-through boy was sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth. As Diggory sat up, the boy turned to look at them, and Icarus smoke no longer poured from his eyes. They looked pained and sad. He pointed with transparent fingers at the piano, and Diggory noticed the boy's wrists were circled with wire that trailed into nothingness. Diggory stood up to inspect, and in the center of the instrument, above the keys, tarnished gold letters were set into the wood. Persephone, Diggory read, and the boy was standing next to him then, very close, and shaking his head urgently. He put a finger in the middle of the word. Percy. Diggory tried again, and the boy nodded, moving to sit on top of the piano. He tracked Diggory's every movement with his piercing eyes, and Diggory wondered if he was 20 years old or 200. Diggory reached out their hand and found it playing a simple melody on the keys, a melody that Diggory did not recognize, but somehow it spoke things that Diggory could not express. Something stirred in the chasm of Diggory's soul and sparked warmth in the cold cavity of their chest. I'm sorry if I disturbed you, Percy. I've been walking. I have always been walking. I have not met anyone else. I am glad to meet you. Tremors of emotion crossed Percy's face, and if the stitches in his mouth pained him, it seemed as though the absence of speech pained him more.
I really wanted, mostly in that middle story, to kind of set the tone for the sort of story that Hello from the Hallowoods goes on to sort of focus. And we do have, I think, probably scarier episodes. We have episodes with great forest monsters and post-apocalyptic horror and all this jazz. But I think the tone of this first episode is fairly melancholic. And I think, at least especially with Diggory's story, tries to focus in a little bit that this is going to be a horror story that is mostly about people's emotions. And then a good bit of the setting of the characters will sort of fall into place as we explore that.
Is there something about this particular story that you wanted to choose to tell first?
It was really important, I think, that in a way it kind of stands by itself. And I think like if this were sort of the only episode you listen to, like you could walk away and it would stand in its own right. It was important to find a moment in Diggory's story early on where we would get to see that kind of sense of empathy that they have and kind of get to tune into their sort of emotional nature a little bit. And then the challenge, as it always is from there, is like, okay, I have this great intro sequence. I have this moment, this meet cute, if you will, or, meet uncute as it may be. But, where can I take it from here? And like, how does that factor into this bigger story that I want to tell?
Yeah.
And so, I thought that was kind of a nice way to begin Diggory's story. And I think an important moment for the audience to see. As it continues to kind of inform the story today.
And as for Jonah and Riot, you just like cliffhangers? Is that what it is?
A little bit. This comes down a little bit to the nature of like podcasting as well, but like you want people to tune in for that next episode. I think I have definitely gotten just better at the cliffhanger thing over time. I think the best way to get someone tuning in now is not necessarily just a cliffhanger where it's like, oh no, they fell into a cabinet and you don't know what's happened to them. But the way to do that a little bit better is to focus it on like the character's decisions and focus it on the character's sort of direction so that it's like, oh, they've reached a bad conclusion over the course of this episode. I want to tune in next time to see what they've done like with this conclusion and sort of like what action they've been propelled to do.
Yeah.
So, I think it definitely can be more graceful than just, oh no, the plot has kidnapped them again.
So what do you struggle with?
There's a couple of things. I set out from the onset to make this a weekly show. And what that means is that outside of like a couple of weeks, I don't have any like quiet weeks on this show. Every episode needs to be able to be written, typed up, recorded, edited within like 1 week turnaround, which means that really this show has been sort of a constant part of my life for these last 2.5 years of production.
Do you ever think about going to like every 2 weeks, give yourself a little break?
I don't think so. I think at least for this show in particular, like that weekly release and the fact that the payoff for all these cliffhangers and all these continuations of the story is only a week away. That's a part of the audience experience that was high priority for this project. And likewise, there's a number of fans out there who are like, oh yeah, this is the highlight of my week. Like I get up at like 5 a.m. to go listen to this new episode when it drops. That kind of enthusiasm like is something I want to nurture, but it also comes at a cost for making this show. And I think beyond that, it is also just getting into the stage where it is big enough now that I've essentially been able to like leave my marketing day job and like, commit that time instead towards working on this show and making that weekly episode happen. Working on side projects. We've got a novel, 100 Eyes in the Dark, that is finished and just sort of pending a release date. With that in mind, though, it is still sort of just barely like essentially covering what that 9-to-5 job would. And so it's in this awkward stage where like I am a full-time creator now, but as more income or more support or more audience comes for the show, that will become a little bit easier and, a little bit more comfortable. So, it's like, yes, I'm a professional creator, but like just barely right now.
Well, let's talk about that since you brought it up. Obviously, there's business concerns. Well, how do you measure success?
If I am able to tell stories and do that as a living, then I consider that successful. It doesn't have to be glorious. It doesn't have to be like paying for a cottage in Bristol or something. As long as I'm able to continue telling these stories and continuing to like express these thoughts to the audience, then I think that really constitutes success for me. And in most ways, I would say like I'm already there for what that metric needs to look like.
So what are some lessons that you have learned about creating audio drama that you can share with people who might want to create their own?
Don't be afraid to get started. I see a lot of people contemplating, oh, what if I made an audio drama, but I don't know anything about it. I don't have any skills. I'm not sure that I'm ready. And the big thing is do you have the story to tell? And if you do, then I think don't let that technical stuff hold you back. You will have to learn a lot of it as you go, but a lot of us learned it as we went. A lot of us are still learning on the fly. Even the creators that you know and love the most are probably on YouTube researching new stuff to do with their sound editing software, every so often. So don't be afraid to learn. And although it can be scary to learn publicly, where everyone can tune into your early stuff, that is part of the process. The only way that you're going to get better at this with time is if you actually start somewhere and begin to make something.
Dreams are powerful things. They signify truths we may not yet allow ourselves to believe. You may return now to your usual dreams. I suggest the one with the teeth. I enjoy the one with the teeth. For your nightmares now and future, I am your loyal host, Nick, waiting with anticipation for your return to the Hallowoods.
There is something hopeful amid the decay and death of the Hallowoods. Wellman's storytelling is evocative and calm, and while the characters may be monstrous, they have human souls and struggle with human needs, purpose, understanding, and love. You can listen to Hello from the Hallowoods on most major podcast platforms, or see our show notes for more details. The First Episode of is written and produced by W. Keith Timms. All the opinions expressed in this show belong to the people who expressed them, and not necessarily to anyone else. The theme song is Mockingbird by David Mumford. This show is a production of Alien Ghost Robot Creative Media. If you want more information, want to sign up for our newsletter, or are an audio drama creator and would like to be on the show, visit our website at TheFirstEpisodeOf.com. We're happy to be a part of the Audio Drama Lab, a Discord-based resource for audio drama development and networking. Check it out at audiodramalab.com. Keep telling stories. It's the only way we're going to get out of this mess. Until next time. I know you got questions about him. Where did he come from? How did he do all those things they say he did? Was he a terrorist? Was he crazy? Was his skin really blue? Well, I'll tell you what I know. I was there with him, driving through the back roads under the stars. I was witness to wonders and miracles, and to the darkness that's coursing through the veins of our country. He came to fight it in his own strange way, but no one leaves that fight unchanged. Not even Rael. People ought to know the truth. And I was there. The Book of Constellations is a down-to-earth sci-fi road trip. It's audio fiction, and you can find episodes at bookofconstellations.com or wherever you get your podcasts.